We're going to tell this story from a really unique perspective, from the house itself. Yeah, you heard that right. We're talking about the house at 2119 30th Street. And from its point of view, it watched this kid named Randy grow up and, basically discover the entire world through radio waves back in the early 1960s. So imagine the house saying this: if my walls could complain, the early 1960s would have provided ample opportunity. I mean, that just sets the stage perfectly, doesn't it? This is a story about sound, about a space just getting filled to the brim, and about the obsession that was about to take over everything, rock and roll. And the epicenter of this whole sonic takeover, it was Randy's sunroom. What was once this quiet little space, well, it pretty much transformed overnight into his personal broadcast studio, all powered by these incredible new sounds blasting from top 40 radio. So these three San Diego AM stations, they were basically Randy's constant companions. You had the cleverly named Radio KDO, KCBQ, and KGB. He knew their formats, he knew the DJs, guys like Shadow Jackson and Johnny Holiday, as well as he knew his own family. Seriously. These weren't just call signs on a dial, they were the actual voices curating the soundtrack of his life. And man, what a soundtrack it was. The sheer variety just screams early 60s, right? It started with the super smooth harmonies of the Shirelles, and of course, that local SoCal surf rock from the Beach Boys. But then the British invasion hit. And suddenly, the Beatles were pouring out of the speakers. And let me tell you, everything changed. But you know how it is. Amidst all those huge hits, there's always that one song that just hits different. For Randy, it was I Love How You Love Me by the Paris Sisters. For a kind of shy teenager, trying to figure out the whole romance thing, this song's dreamy lyrics, it was like they were speaking directly to him. It just captured a feeling he couldn't quite put into words himself yet. But here's the thing about Randy. It was never enough to just listen. No way. His passion started to evolve into something more. He had this deep, innate need to understand the system behind the hits. And that's where the story takes a really fascinating analytical turn. So you've got these two sides to his personality, which is really interesting. On one hand, you have his other hobby, DXing. That's listening for super distant radio stations. That was a private, quiet, headphones on, nighttime kind of thing. But rock and roll, that was a public, loudspeaker blasting, daytime obsession that just filled the entire house. And yet, what's wild is that both of them were driven by the exact same analytical curiosity. And his data collection process, it was incredibly methodical. First, he'd start local, grabbing all the top 40 surveys from the newsstands. Then, he'd go national. He'd make these weekly trips to the public library just to copy down Billboard's top 100 charts by hand. And get this, he even used his DXing network to get surveys from stations all across the country. He was basically creating his own comparative analysis of what people were listening to everywhere. His absolute favorite show was this one on KCBQ called Battle of the New Sounds. And the reason was simple. It turned listeners like him into active participants. You could actually call in and vote for your favorite new song, and your vote could directly influence whether it got a shot at the charts. For a guy like Randy, this wasn't just entertainment. It was appointment listening. It was his weekly chance to try and predict the next big hit. But for all the data and the charts, the most memorable event of this entire time had nothing to do with any of that. It was all about a promotional contest from Radio KDO that turned into a full-blown adventure, and ultimately a piece of family legend. So what was the prize? $25. Now, I know, that doesn't sound like a lot today, but for a teenager in 1961, that was a small fortune. So you better believe, the hunt was on. And Randy, being Randy, of course, approached it systematically. He recruited his brother Stan and their friend Kurt. They all hopped on a bus downtown, and they just started methodically combing through the big department stores. But hours went by, and nothing. They were starting to think the whole thing was a hoax. And then, on an elevator, they saw her. A young lady wearing a light blue sweater. Randy just knew this was their chance, and he urgently whispers to his brother, "Ask her." So Stan, he takes a breath, and he just asks the question that could win them the whole thing. Are you the Radio KDO sweater girl? I mean, imagine it. The entire day's hunt, all that searching, it all came down to this one single moment. And she was. She confirmed it right then and there in the elevator. Stan had won. His name was actually announced on KDEO, and for a day, those three boys were heroes. That story became absolutely legendary in their family. It was just this perfect mix of Randy's careful planning, Stan's boldness, and, yeah, a little bit of good old-fashioned luck. You know, when you look back on it, these rock and roll years were so much more than just a hobby for Randy. They were really about how an entire generation was finding its identity. And music was the medium for that discovery. And really, this is what it all boils down to. It didn't matter if it was DXing for a faint signal in the middle of the night or tracking top 40 hits in broad daylight. Randy's fundamental approach to the world was always the same. He was just wired to observe, to collect data, to analyze the patterns, and to understand the systems that made it all work. So, in a way, the music itself was like a data set of feelings. You had the Paris sisters, and they represented that unspoken romance. Then the Beach Boys, well, they just captured that Southern California spirit he was living and breathing. And the Beatles, they were the sound of a full-blown cultural revolution. They were living proof that the world was changing right before his very ears. Of course, things change. Eventually, the sunroom did get a little quieter. Randy's interests shifted, and that constant broadcast started to fade out. But that incredibly intense period of musical immersion, it had absolutely served its purpose. It connected him to an entire generation and taught him about the world in a way that really nothing else could. And that's why this story is such a great reminder that music is never, ever just background noise. It's kind of like the data file of our youth, isn't it? It's the system we use to make sense of our own lives. And it really makes you think. Every single generation has its soundtrack. So, what was yours?